Welcome, students, to the Human Rights Center, University of Padua. This is the place where we strive for disseminating human rights and sustainability in terms of people and planet. And thanks to Professor Gupta, both are addressed in this class. As I've introduced via Moodle this class, we are very honored and somehow thrilled to have such a distinguished guest today for you. She will address the topic of climate change, sustainability, and how to, let's say, balance development, growth, not growth, development, it is better than growth, development within the boundaries in terms of people and planet. Before that, I want also to express the personal welcome from the president, namely Marco Mascia, and the entire community of the Human Rights Center. We love human rights defender, and given your distinguished lecture you had today, I got the feeling that you are well beyond to be a scientist. You are using the science for benefiting people and people within the planet. So you are 100% part of the human rights defenders. In this afternoon, you have a different master's program, namely the joint international master's program funded by the Erasmus, with the Erasmus Mundus. Again, in this class, you have students from, I would say, all continents. I guess only Oceania is missing, Australia and Oceania. But we have Africa, Asia, Europe, and Americas, both North and South. So I hope you will get also some feedbacks from their perspective on this very important topic, that it is at the core of their master's program, that is the climate change and the sustainability for territories. The floor is yours, and thanks again and once more to have designed your agenda that is very complicated, but she's here for you, and leverage this opportunity to grab as much as you can. I see in the meantime all students are now joining us. Yeah, I see also my PhD students, some from second year students, and just new enrolled students. So thanks again to take part of this discussion, especially for what there will be tomorrow, but step by step. Now the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm trying to talk to you about how we need to share our world. And in doing so, I'm hoping that I will mobilize you to be more than students and to become citizens of the world, which means not just doing your normal work, but getting out and talking about climate change and the need to share our world. So let me just explain a little bit about where I am starting from. We are right now in the middle of a very unhealthy world. The planet has got huge problems, and that is also affecting human health, but also the health of other species. So today we find that about a quarter of all deaths and morbidity are caused by the pollution of the planet, whether it is air pollution, water pollution, climate change, etc. And of course, air pollution is one of the biggest killers, killing around 7 million people annually, both indoor and outdoor. But you also have water pollution, which causes all kinds of diseases from cholera to diarrhea, etc. And then, of course, our antibiotics are draining into the water system, and they're causing new sets of medical problems for all of us. Loss of biodiversity leads to the rise of zoonotic disease. 60% of all infectious disease is zoonotic, coming from animals to humans. And if there aren't enough fish in the oceans, people who are eating fish and benefiting from the protein in the fish will suffer, because that's one of the cheapest foods for mostly coastal people worldwide. Land degradation is another big problem. 3.2 billion people worldwide suffer from the fact that their lands cannot produce as much as they used to. And of course, most of you apparently have plastic in your brain the size of a teaspoon. on average. And we don't know what this does to you. And in the Netherlands recently, a report came out which said that we should not eat the eggs from the chickens in our own gardens because it might have PFAS in it. And this PFAS has not been put by us in our gardens, but it is coming through the environment into our systems. And so basically what is happening is that the way we live, the way we eat, consume, use energy, enjoy life, that is having repercussions on the environment directly or indirectly, which then has repercussions back on our own health, but also the health of the planet. And a lot of these toxins in the water and air, they will have major impacts on our mental health, as well as I heard last week at a cancer conference that it will also aggravate cancers. Moreover, more people get displaced by environmental degradation than wars. And we also need to think about the fact that both of these problems, because wars also degrade the environment, and so both of these problems need to be treated. Now, if it is such a big health problem, and we covered this in our UNEP report, Healthy Planet, Healthy People, which sort of depicts the world we want with more solar energy and more time to relax. If we have such a big problem, why are we not taking action? Over here on the x-axis, you see privileged people and marginalized people. And on the y-axis, you're seeing the contribution to the causes of the environmental problem. And what you basically find is that the more privileged you are, the more likely you are to have a huge footprint on the environment. And the less privileged you are, the less likely you have a big footprint. And it's not because you're eating more breakfast or lunch. It's also because you have a pension which is invested in various ways, or your savings are invested in various ways. And so directly or indirectly, rich people have a much larger influence on the planet. But when you look at who is affected, and I'm not talking in monetary terms, but in terms of existential risks, risks to your life, to your health, to your whether you can continue to stay where you stay, then you will find it is precisely the most marginalized who are more vulnerable and the rich who are less vulnerable. So even though we will be exposed to a same changing climate, maybe we have more options to deal with it than the poorest. And this basically means that the super rich are less motivated to solve the problem because they feel that they are not necessarily the community that will be worst affected. But in many ways, they are violating the human rights of the most marginalized people, or even the lower middle class people in the world. And so what you're seeing is that, in a sense, a lot of this is about, are we allowed to cause damage to people elsewhere in the world? Who allows us to do that? Why are we allowed to do that? Why are we not protecting the human rights of others? A debate we've been having for quite some time in the academic community is how many people should die before a problem is seen as serious? Does anybody want to volunteer a guess? We are talking in the SDGs about leaving no one behind. And yet, when we're talking about climate change or water pollution or air pollution, we are leaving thousands of people behind, if not at least 100,000. So how do you all feel about the gap between the promise of leaving no one behind, human rights of every individual, and the fact that we are causing damage to everybody? Does anybody have any ideas? Where should we draw the line? How many deaths are unacceptable to you? Would you like to take a guess? None? Now, if she says none, is that possible for us? What it would mean for us? We would have to stop everything practically to make sure that no one dies as a side effect of everything we are doing. Somebody else wants to say yes? Go ahead, put up, yeah. Right. But is it so that the privileged people have more human rights than non-privileged people? So when we say, I mean, you are basically saying that it depends on who is hurt. And if it's a less privileged person, maybe we don't care because maybe they're not part of our inner circle. And maybe that is the history behind the way we are dealing with these issues. And I still want to come back because this is a human rights group. When we talk about human rights, we're talking about every person on earth. We're also talking about the rights of other species in some ways, because not only do they have rights in themselves, which may or may not be recognized by governments, but some countries are now recognizing the right of the river, the rights of various ecosystems. But beyond that, we need the ecosystems for our own survival. So it's not like it's completely selflessness in trying to protect the natural system or the biophysical system. But essentially, this debate about who is causing the problem and who is hurt is a key issue. Now, normally, when we are doing environmental research, we use the DPSIR model. What is the driver of the problem? What is the pressure? What is the impact of the problem? And then what is the state of the problem? What is the impact? And then how do we respond? Now, this is a very technocratic storyline. To that storyline, we've added a justice dimension. So we say, how do drivers result from, mitigate, or exacerbate inequalities? Who uses and pollutes resources and sinks? How is exposure to benefits and risks distributed? How are impacts distributed? Who is able to adapt? Who pays for residual damage? And lastly, how do responses redistribute rights, risks, and responsibilities? So essentially, what we're trying to do is trying to promote a way for more technocratic scholars, if you like, or to try and take the justice story into account when they are doing this analysis, because a lot of the research will say humans emit greenhouse gases. But the fact is that it's a minority of humans that are emitting the greenhouse gases and a very other group of people who are getting impacted. So to bring that out to the top of the discussions. So let me talk a little bit about justice with you all. So what is justice? A lot of people will agree about what is injustice, but there's a lot of disagreement about what is justice, both among social scientists, lawyers as well, natural scientists. So when we did a literature review, we looked at what do justice scholars say. So justice scholars often are focused on local anthropological issues, cultural issues, contextual issues. And so they are very much focused at the local level. And then there are some that are more looking at the global and universal level. And then you have justice scholars who are focused more at the conservative, incremental level, and justice scholars who focus more on ideal transformative level. Now, I'm talking about the Earth Commission right now. I was the co-chair for some time. Our argument there was that if you are on the left side, then basically you take a lot of the rules as given and you are implementing it and maybe making some incremental changes. But that tends to reproduce inequality. And so what we really need to do is to move to the right side and have a global to local iterative storyline where we are taking local justice issues, global justice narratives, and linking the two continuously. But we are on this side, we're focusing more on the ideal transformative side of the justice narrative, because we argue that this will not lead to justice, it will merely reproduce existing inequalities. You are welcome to stop me at any time if you want me to answer a question. Huh? So just feel free to do so. So taking that into account, we started to think, what would justice mean at the planetary level? Because we are now in the middle of the Anthropocene. So I argued that justice must not only be ideal, it must be focused on recognition and epistemic justice. So if you talk to a businessman, he might tell you that his responsibility is to his CEO or to his shareholders, but it's not to the general stakeholders along the value chain of the production process. So the question is, how do we prioritize recognition of all the people who are contributing directly or indirectly to the value chain? That's recognition justice. Epistemic justice starts from the point of view that it's not just our knowledge that matters, but the knowledge of anybody else that is relevant for this. So if you take water, for example, many of us might see water as a resource, but there are communities in the world that see water as a relationship, as a lifeblood, as a cultural heritage. as something that is the source of all life. And if you see water as a relationship and as a source of all life, the way you deal with water is hopefully much more respectful than if you just think of water as a resource that you can buy and sell and trade in the markets. So your attitude is different toward water, and therefore your behavior is different. So epistemic justice implies that you also need to take other ways of thinking. And then we have interspecies, intergenerational, and intragenerational justice. So how much land, how much space can we take away from intact nature? But even in a city like this, how much land should we give back to nature? And why is that important? So those are the sort of interspecies questions that you'd like to ask. But you also want to know about the system stability. The water cycle must be stable because it provides us rainfall and it replenishes our water system. So you want the water cycle to work. But also it's intergenerational. How did past users of resources affect us today? How do our current users affect resources tomorrow? And then the third is intra. So that is the question that you were discussing. How do we care about some people and not care about other people? So how do we relate to different generations within the current generation? And then this input goes into the narrative about procedural justice and substantive justice. Now, that's the conceptualization of our storyline. And then we operationalize it in terms of ends and means. And for now, our ends are how can we draw boundaries to the system to prevent significant harm to humans? And how can we elaborate the boundaries also with standards, quality standards of water, for example, or air? Then we look at the foundation. If we have to meet the minimum needs of all people, what is the impact of meeting those needs on the boundaries? So we go a little bit further than the donut approach, which basically looks at the minimum needs slightly differently. We calculate them in the same terms as the outer boundaries. And then we look at what is left. And that is what we have to share between all of us. The next question is to solve this problem of sharing, we have to address the causes of environmental degradation and the causes of inequality. Because from our perspective, inequality is not something that you are born with. Inequality is created by the systems we have. So if you have a system which has much more social access to resources and goods, you have fewer people who do not have access to education and healthcare. And if your system doesn't have that, then you have more poverty and more vulnerability. So it's created by the system. That is our starting point. The next part, yes?
No. So the intergenerational justice, does it mean justice between the same generation?
Yes.
Or between different generation at one present moment?
No, intragenerational for the purpose of this storyline means justice within the same generation. So all of us are living together. So the question is justice between communities, people, countries.
Yeah.
That's the, and the inter, and that's very difficult to figure out because how many generations do you take into account in intergenerational justice? Some indigenous communities say we must take 7 generations past and 7 future. Some people see a generation as 20 years, 30 years, but of course, some of us live for a long time. So the issue of what is an intergenerational justice is still out there. I was hoping that the UN, when they were talking about their pact for the future, that they would define what a generation is, but they have not. So that's something we still have to do in the course of this project. And then when you look at the drivers of harm, the next question is, can we create liability and compensation from those who have caused the harm to those who are receiving the harm? And then how do we allocate the remaining resources equitably, and how do we allocate responsibilities in a fair manner? So if you are working for a fossil fuel company and the company is closing down, of course you have a family to feed, you have an income you're going to lose. So how do we do this in as gentle a manner as possible to enable you to also have a good life and not just become unemployed overnight? And that's very important in this responsibility storyline. So putting it slightly differently, if you have a boundary then the question is the safe boundary also just? And the second question is, can we meet the minimum needs of all people within these boundaries? Is the allocation of the remaining resources just? Is the allocation of risks and harm just? Is the allocation of responsibilities just? So let me just go back to climate change, and I'm sure you are all familiar with this, but basically we have the sun's rays hit the earth, and some of it reflects back, right? The problem is when we emit greenhouse gases, we create a blanket around the earth which absorbs the greenhouse gases, and that absorbs the heat and makes the earth warmer. That is the problem. And so this is a very simple problem in some ways, but it has a number of big challenges for all of us because it means that your sea level is rising. So if you are boiling water, you will see that the water rises as it gets hotter. So the oceans are rising because it's getting hotter. The oceans are rising because the glaciers are melting. The oceans are also rising because we're pumping out groundwater, which is not a climate change issue. So there are many things that combine together to create a bigger problem. But if the glaciers melt, then you have less water recharge in your groundwater system. And most of the water we drink and use for farming is coming from groundwater. Much less comes from surface water. So if you take out too much water, there's a problem also. But if you are not recharging the water system, that is a problem. So you have essentially also the problem that the air becomes very warm, and it can take, for every 1 degree rise in temperature, a 7% increase in water vapor. Now that water vapor becomes so heavy, it comes down like a rain bomb. Now, when it comes down like a rain bomb, like in Valencia or Durban, it basically creates so much damage across that area that you have a problem. True, it might help to recharge your groundwater system, but we are not sure which of the two impacts will be most present. And there are other impacts as well. And of course, water is very important because it basically means our food system, our industrial system, our health system, everything is affected. Right. So moving from there, a big problem that we face right now is that when you cross 2 degrees centigrade in relation to pre-industrial times, you might trigger all kinds of tipping elements. So you have to visualize a chair where you're rocking and it's okay, it's coming back. But at a certain point you rock and it falls. That's a tipping point when you completely change the system. And so when you're changing the system, this can lead to global tipping points and regional tipping points. The map on the top shows you global tipping points, at the bottom, local tipping points. Global tipping points include the Amazon rainforest, which might turn into a net emitter of greenhouse gases as a combination of both deforestation, but also because the forests themselves have to struggle to cope with the impacts of climate change. So if that happens, you have a major problem. The other problem is when the oceans, which are shown in yellow, the Atlantic circulation, if that comes to change, and that will have a huge impact on the climates of all the regions around. If I go to the lower half, I'll just focus to the region I come from, which is India. And there you will see in light blue the mountain glaciers of the Himalayas. Now, if the mountain glaciers of the Himalayas continue to melt, then basically you will have flooding in the short term, but in the long term, you will have less water for the entire region that the Himalayas provides water for. And that will be a long-term disastrous problem combined with the fact that it will be very, very hot. And so that would mean that there's also more evaporation. So how those people will survive is going to be complicated. One of my colleagues has written a paper where they talk about the fact that we are moving outside the niche in which humans can live. And that is going to be a big problem. Okay, so I'm sure you're all familiar with a graph like this. It's slightly the emissions gap report, basically, and it shows you in black the fossil carbon dioxide. Then you have methane, and on top of methane, you have nitrous oxide. Then you have the F gases, the fluorochlorocarbons, and then in green, you have the emissions of greenhouse gas emissions from deforestation. I'm going to focus mostly on fossil fuel, but we can also talk about the others should you be so interested. So basically, when we are talking about climate change, we are talking about stabilizing global concentrations of greenhouse gases. But if you want to stabilize it, your emissions need to go to zero. It's like a glass of water. If you want to stabilize the water in the glass, want to stabilize salt in the glass at 2 teaspoons, after you've put 2 teaspoons of salt into it, on the next day, you can't put any more salt because the concentration has been reached. So we have to get to zero. If we have to get to zero, how big is this carbon cake that we have to share amongst each other? So for a 2-degree world, it was 790 gigaton carbon, and that big cake is now shrinking and shrinking and shrinking as we move towards 2025, 2030. So the window for action is closing rapidly. And just before we go much further, there's a huge difference between 1 degree, 1.5 degrees, and 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. If prior to 1990, there were some papers that said that we should focus on up to 1 degree, that was green. Between 1 degree and 2 degrees, it was orange, like a traffic light, because some parts of the world would suffer, and beyond 2 degrees, the whole world would suffer. So we had that kind of knowledge. And still, we delayed the adoption of a quantitative target till 2015. And then we chose for 2 degrees. And some of the small island states protested and asked for 1.5 degrees. But there was no scientific basis for that because there was no material available. And then IPCC was asked to come up with a special report on 1.5. And that special report shows roughly what the difference of between a half-degree change is. So for example, on extreme heat, at 2 degrees centigrade, 37% of the world's population will suffer. At 1.5 degrees centigrade, it's 14% will suffer from heat. And our research shows that at 1 degree centigrade, it's around 70 million people that will suffer. And that is less than 1%. So as you go up the temperature, the number of people that will suffer is incredibly high. If you look at, for example, species loss, then you will see that at 2 degrees, we lose 16% of the species. At 1.5, 8% of the species. But the one that suffers the most is coral reefs. At 2 degrees, it's 99%. At 1.5, 70 to 90%. And I think last week a report came out saying that a lot of the coral reefs are already past recovery. So there's a huge difference between these levels. And most of you probably did not hear this because your governments are not implementing the articles of the Climate Convention, which requires them to educate everybody. And most of you may have studied this in school because you're quite young, but generally speaking, people above the ages of 30, 35 have never studied this. So they are really completely in the blank often about what this problem is. So now we are talking about what is the current situation. The current situation is that our emissions are pretty high. If we continue with current policies, we'll probably take the top blue line. If we do some of the pledges that we promised in the Climate Convention, in the Paris Agreement, and thereafter, maybe we'll take the lower blue line, but actually we should be following the green line, which is the Paris compliant line. So just to give you a few minutes on the politics. 1990, the negotiation starts. By the way, I started work on climate change in 1988, so I've been through this. 1990, the negotiations start. Idea is rich countries must reduce their emissions first so that poor countries can still increase their emissions. Those days, many of the poor countries were unbelievably poor. Then 1992, we get the treaty and everybody is quite happy, rich countries and poor countries. But there was a target for rich countries to reduce their emissions in 2000 with respect to 1990. And of course, the United States did not agree. And so the chairperson of the negotiation sent the US and the UK to another room to discuss it. And they came back with a linguistic trick. And basically, they split the target into 2 paragraphs. One paragraph talks about 2000. Another paragraph talks about what should happen in 1990. And the lawyers basically say there is no target. So that was a really big problem with the 1992 convention. Then Europe, of course, knows this. The developing countries realize this a little later because it was quite complicated for them to know what is exactly being said with all these words that are being used. And so in 1997, we get the Kyoto Protocol, now with targets for all of Europe and all of the developed countries. A little side story over here is within Europe, we were negotiating about rich European countries and poor European countries. Rich European countries had to reduce their emissions to make space for poor European countries to go up. A number of countries outside Europe were listening very carefully because they wanted to ask to increase their emissions even though they were rich. And so once the negotiations took place between the US and Europe, and then they've settled on a couple of numbers, then these other countries came back and said, but we want to increase our emissions, notably Iceland, Norway, Australia. And so basically, this meant that developing countries were more upset because some rich countries are still being allowed to increase their emissions. And worse still, eventually, the US and Canada do not join the Kyoto Protocol. And because they don't join, the entire North America is sending a message to the developing world, we don't want to commit to this problem. Then you get the Doha Amendment. So the Kyoto Protocol is for 2008 to 2012, the Doha Amendment 2012 to 2020, one second. And basically what was happening then is that that amendment was supposed to apply to most countries, but here you see the US, Canada, Russia do not join. And then we get the Paris Agreement of 2015, which was being promoted in France with the help of some others. And that comes up with new targets beyond 2030. One small story before you get the floor is that what you find is that in the early years, in 1992, countries are willing to adopt a target for 2000 with respect to 1990. So that means within their current government. But when you get to 1997, the target is for the period 2008 to 2012. So many years later, so the current government is not committing itself. It's committing a future government. And ditto in Paris, because 2015, they adopt the target, but it's not for 2015, it's for 2020 onwards. Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a few details about the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. In the Kyoto Protocol, they also introduced a very dangerous notion, which was the clean development mechanism, in which the low developing countries were responsible for offsetting, and developed countries, as you said, were able to put as much emissions as they said. And developing countries agreed to this. But then in the Paris, but it was very controversial, how emissions can be just like sold to developing countries. And in the Paris Agreement, one of the reasons why the US did not want it to be a law or protocol is because they said that for it to be this way, it has to go through Congress. And so the president would have to go through Congress, and then the Obama at the time and many presidents were very sure that the Congress would not approve of it. And I'm wondering, what you think about that.
So what you find is that in Paris, they did not say a Paris Convention or a Paris Protocol, because if it uses the word convention or protocol, it has to go to Congress. There's another criteria, and that is there must be no quantitative obligation directly on the United States, because then also it has to go for Senate approval. And so they called it the Paris Agreement. And so the entire world agreed to change the title. Of course, maybe they didn't even realize that they were changing the title. Agreed so that by executive order, President Obama could then ratify the agreement. By having done so, it made it easier for the follow-up president, Mr. Trump, to take off the signature. And then again, easier for President Biden when he came in to sign. And now again for President Trump to take his signature off. And this process is quite problematic because the whole world is hostage to this executive power of the president and how it is increasing rapidly right now. But this, I guess, in some ways, it began with a very well-meaning thought process, because President Obama was trying very hard to get the United States back into the agreement and not to stay outside. For me, the most important thing is that by staying outside the agreements, they are sending messages to developing countries that they don't care, right? That is the wrong message, because you want developing countries to feel that they should also participate effectively in climate change. So that is, for me, one of the bigger problems. Of course, what they are saying outside does not mean that within the country there is no change. I hear right now that renewables are becoming so cost effective in the United States, that in fact it is displacing existing other fossil fuel. But still, if the message doesn't come out, it creates a problem. Yes.
Oh, so things changed with the Paris Agreement. I wanted to ask you if you think like these protocols and agreements that have been going on for since 1990 have actually had an impact. Like, are countries actually like meeting the responsibilities that they assumed?
If you compare the climate agreement with all the other agreements at international level, most other agreements are jealous about the amount of attention that goes to climate change. Climate change is one of the few negotiations where presidents and prime ministers come because they're so scared about what it means. Not so, they're scared about what climate change means for their country in terms of adaptation, but they're even more scared about what climate change means for their country in terms of what they think is energy security. So you see that the fact is that it gets a huge amount of attention. It's every year. Without this every year focus, you would not find that all countries on the world at least know something about climate change. You've seen them come together. Whether it's going fast enough or not, that's a different question. I would say it's not going fast enough, but that still means the situation is also affected by a whole lot of other things. For example, if you look at politics in countries, most prime ministers come for 4 years or 5 years, and they don't want to rock the boat. So they want to postpone action to the future. Most CEOs are only there in big Fortune 500 companies for 3.5 years. They don't want to rock the boat. They want to take their bonuses and run. So what you see is as a short-term mentality every time with this. Whereas when we are looking at universities, we have to do integrity. I mean, I'm sure you guys all have to go to courses on ethics, integrity, etc. Lawyers have to do follow-up courses. Apparently, politicians don't have to do that, and no one can hold them responsible if they're not telling the truth. And that makes it a very complicated storyline to make sure that they too obey. But I'm going to come to some of these issues that you both have raised in further questions. Yes.
I just wanted to give like follow-up question to that. I think one of the like successful conventions or that like happened in the environmental sphere is the Montreal Convention, and the US was prominent and they were very active in making that happen. I'm wondering why you think that succeeded and the Paris Agreement did not.
If you go back to the Vienna Convention on the ozone layer, you will find that it gave companies time to move towards the global south. That's one of my hypotheses. So basically, it was easier for many of these countries to allow these companies to shift to the global south and produce there. So they were not being closed down. That's one thing. In 1985, when the Vienna Convention was negotiated, there were only 14 companies working on CFC production and what at that time. So it was very easy to close down those 13 companies or to make those 13 companies change. But they didn't do it. And in 1990, then they started the process, and it was a much more manageable problem. They didn't solve it. And I think there's still problems with that entire sector. It's not that they've solved the entire problem. If I'm not mistaken, they've gone on to other gases that are relevant. And then that is a bit of a problem that they are facing. I'm not convinced that it's a very good example to cite when you talk about climate change, because climate change is everybody's life. There's nothing you are doing every day which does not use energy. So it's like it's pervasive, but many of us can avoid using CFCs. So it's a different story. Let me now go a little bit into climate injustice. So climate injustice, basically, if you look at the per capita emissions, you will see that the more red the countries are, the greater their per capita emissions. So you can see where the countries are located in the world. If you look at the most vulnerable countries, then you can see again through the darker red countries, the most vulnerable countries are in the global south. Of course, this is not in financial terms, but existential terms. So if on the x-axis you have time and on the y-axis you have greenhouse gas emissions, we have to get greenhouse gas emissions to zero. And this means that every year, the amount of emissions you can have is shrinking. And this means that as we move towards 2030, 2040, 2050, we will fight more and more with each other as to who has the right to switch that light on? Who has the right to fly to a university like this? Who has the right to use fossil fuel? And that is the situation we have reached right now, where countries are really battling with each other. And that can explain a little bit why Paris was agreed to on a voluntary basis, because by then the cake that you can share is really small. Now we are not following this path. We are in overshoot, and that is causing all kinds of demands. So overall, worldwide, we are seeing greater demand for justice. And these court cases, these are not only revolts on the street, but they're also court cases. I think there are 2,300 or more court cases worldwide. And you also have court cases at the international level. I'll come back to that later. Technology can help solve some of these problems, like renewables could help solve some of these problems, especially if we can solve the battery issue and make that more sustainable. But we also have two technologies that are very problematic: AI, which uses a lot of energy, and defense. As you probably know, this June, NATO countries agreed to increase their expenditure on defense to 5% of GDP from 2%. And that means they're going to spend a lot of money on weapons, but also a lot of energy will be used in that. And the military emissions are not always reported. It's not compulsory to report them within the climate negotiation process. So let's do another justice story. In 1990, we were thinking that as countries become richer, they emit more. But after a while, they become so rich, they can buy technologies that are less polluting. So they will decouple emissions from wealth. But what we find is that even if they were able to decouple slightly, in a sense, what happened was that their demand went up. So with every child being born, a new phone was given to the child, or a new television, or a new product, etc. So your emissions are going up. So today we have reached the point that rich countries must get to zero, which means that their technologies and lifestyles and consumption patterns are not appropriate for global South countries, which is bad news for rich countries. They don't like to hear this. When you talk to developing countries, they need to get to zero too. And when you talk to developing country government officials, they get upset because they think it is their turn to live like people did in New York or do in New York. So they think it's not fair that I should come and tell them you need to get to zero as quickly as possible, because that is the most sustainable way for you and your children and in your future. So this is the debate that we are having. But in the academic world, we think you both have to get to zero fast. The third problem is that every 4 years, governments have postponed action, whether in the rich world or in the poor world. And this basically means that we have postponed action to such a point that now if you want to get to 1.5 or 2, we have to reduce emissions overnight. And especially global North countries have to have reduced emissions yesterday in order that global South countries have a little bit more time to reduce their emissions. But we were discussing earlier this morning that in Europe, we are not even talking about getting to zero so fast. So it's a problem, because it also sends a message to developing countries that we are not serious. But the problem will affect all of us. So it's a very big justice issue. So I have the wedding cake of climate injustices. The first one is that we knew about the problem of climate change before 1990, and still we waited till 2015. So that's almost 23 years to adopt a quantitative target. By then, that carbon budget has become so small, you can't divide it equitably amongst countries. So that is the second injustice. You cannot divide it fairly. And so you basically tell all countries, you must do what you want. But another big problem is by delaying the target for so long, it makes 1 degree or 1.5 degrees practically unachievable, because we crossed 1.5 last year for the first time. And if we cross it this year and next year and next year and a few more years, then we've crossed 1.5 definitively. So that's a bit of a problem. Now, if I had a cake and I shared the cake with you and it was finished, it was finished. But in the case of fossil fuel, there is no finishing. 78% of the remaining fossil fuel is in the global South. It's in their territory, and they have not yet used it. So they think that if they use this, they can become rich. And that is a way for them to catch up with the global North. So it becomes very difficult to try and convince developing countries not to use this fossil fuel, because it is so important, they see, for their GDP. And worldwide, apparently, the fossil fuel empire is worth between 16 trillion US dollars and 295 trillion US dollars. There are many numbers floating. It depends on how many years you calculate, and how much you calculate. Is a fossil fuel car parked or the fossil fuel empire, and so on and so forth. What is global GDP? Anybody got an idea? How much? 110 US dollars, trillion dollars. And so basically, when you're talking about a fossil fuel empire that is so wealthy, then you know that that fossil fuel empire is pulling the strings. It's basically telling us that we should all be driving electric cars, maybe because our electric car company wants us there, but also the fossil fuel companies and the fossil fuel car companies are pushing us in a certain direction, not just the fossil fuel companies. And then we talk about mitigation instruments. Now, I, as a political scientist, policy scientist, lawyer, we were always taught you must have a good policy mix. You must have regulatory measures, economic measures, suasive measures. You need to persuade society to change its behavior. But as I told you earlier, very few societies did an active education of the public of the climate change problem. A lot of the societies said, what's the cheap way to get rid of our emissions? And a cheap way was to write a check and pay it to another country and to buy their reductions and say, you have reduced it. Because it required just one signature, you could pay a little bit of money and you reduced emissions. You were not trying to change the entire structure of society. And today we are paying the cost of that because our societies have not realized that the next house you buy or the next house you rent should have solar energy. Do you understand? So we didn't make the structural changes that we needed to do. And instead, we did all this offsetting in the global south or in East and Central Europe. And that was a really big problem. That's efficient, but not equitable and not effective. Then we come to adaptation. Today, the adaptation costs are roughly $15 million per hour. And that is seen by the European Union colleagues of mine as an underestimate because it doesn't include a lot of recent damages. So who's going to pay for that? Is it going to be the person who has to pay the bill himself? Or is somebody else going to be held responsible? And finally, the biggest problem, I think, is the way in which our society is structured. Our focus on more and more GDP, more and more growth, more and more purchase, more and more throwing away of t-shirts and buying new t-shirts. That is the way society is organized, which creates a lot of waste, a lot of energy, and that is causing the problem. So we really need to have different narratives about development. And that is where we can learn from other societies, whether it's Ubuntu or Bien Vivir or gross national happiness from Bhutan, etc. So justice issues have multiplied. I'll just give you an example of emissions trading. So in emissions trading, basically you decide what the total budget is, and then you share that between countries, and then countries can trade with each other, and economists say that this is the most efficient solution. Now, for a long time, we did not have a target. Till 2015, we didn't have a target, even though emissions trading was allowed from 1997 onwards and went into force in 2005. So how do you know what the budget is? And then secondly, you could divide it per capita, but then of course, developing countries get the bigger slice of the cake. And now rich countries have to buy the right to pollute from poor countries. Okay, so poor countries wanted this and rich countries didn't want it. And then the next option is grandfathering, and grandfathering gives the rich countries the right to pollute. And now poor countries have to buy the right to pollute from rich countries. Do you follow? So what is grandfathering? Grandfathering is simply if my grandfather had a house and her grandfather didn't have a house, even though we have the same education, I am much richer than she is because I inherit that house eventually. If I use more water every year, I'm the first user of water, I get a grandfathered right to use the water or a historical right to use water. Historical right is what Egypt claims, and in America, it's called a grandfathered right, the first in right, first in time principle for water use. But in climate change, it is like whoever pollutes first gets the right to squat on the atmosphere. And that's the story here. So clearly in the pre-1990 period, so I'm really going back in time, this was already discussed. And rich countries said no to per capita, poor countries said no to grandfathering. And then, of course, for 6 years, we heard nothing about it. And then in Kyoto, it came back. And in Kyoto, basically, the idea was that rich countries reduced their emissions by 5.2%, But they can do that by buying or selling products to the global south, which reduces their emissions there by offsetting. So in theory, it's even possible that the rich countries' emissions keep going this way, but they are getting it offset here, and this is growing like this. So this is not really emissions trading. I mean, this is not the normal system. So this was a really problematic story, and there were NGOs that came up with this currency note, which says the history of colonialism goes in parallel with the creation of new commodities, slavery, sugar, tea, coffee, oil, carbon. And they brought this currency note, I remember, to The Hague in 2000 at the COP. Okay, and then we have a lot of funds. We have funds that are being created on a regular basis to finance some of the developing countries. Do not misunderstand. A fund does not mean extra money. A fund basically means extra bureaucracy, and it means that the rules by which the money is being allocated is changing. It began with a more grant-oriented approach for mitigation under the Global Environment Facility, which is over here. Then there was a little bit of money for adaptation, which came in the Adaptation Fund. And now in the Green Climate Fund, it is much more focused on loans rather than grants. So this is a bit of a challenge. We do talk about 100 billion per year from 2020 onwards in the COP that was done in Paris, but not inside the Paris Agreement. And that money is not being met. And now we have been talking about 300 billion. But as you all know, in some countries of the world, they are canceling official development assistance. So we don't know how much money will ever be there. And up till now, up till 2000, official development assistance money was being relabeled as climate money in many parts of the global north. So it's quite a complicated story on that too. Also, if you read in the newspapers, because some of you are from the global south, that, there is an NGO that is giving money, and then there is a government that is giving money, and then there's a World Bank that is giving money, and then there's somebody else, don't add the money up. Because essentially all the money is coming from governments, a few governments, a handful of governments, a bit 15 to 20 governments used to give aid money. And that money goes to the multilateral development banks, it goes to the NGOs, it goes to other bodies, and then they take a percentage to run their business, of course, and then they give the money out. So you have to actually deduct. Do not make the mistake of thinking there's so much money in the system that everybody has, that you're adding it up. All right, let me go to the next story. I believe that ignoring justice is not an option if you care about climate change and human rights. Because if 78% of the remaining fossil fuel is in the global south, and if they decide to use only their fair share, forget about the entire amount, if they decide to use their fair share, everybody in the world suffers. So it is in the interest of the rich countries to enable developing countries to use alternative energy. Okay, that's my first point. Second point, even in rich countries, there's a huge justice problem. It is the rich people in rich countries that get subsidies for their electric cars, their solar panels, and heat exchange. It's not the single mother down the road who is being helped to get off the fossil fuel. So what you're seeing is that the poorer people in Europe are now protesting because they see the price of fossil fuel going up and they can only afford a fossil fuel vehicle, perhaps. And they can't take it. And so you're seeing these yellow vest protests in France taking place. And you saw that in the Netherlands, Mr. Wilders won the elections a few years ago. And that was also because they did not prioritize climate change, because people in the Netherlands, in the public, they feel that somehow climate change will make them become poorer, or it'll make them pay more money in some way or the other. And they haven't been properly informed about how to deal with this, nor have the subsidies been better organized. So I think we need justice in the global north, and we need justice in the global south. And if we don't get justice in the global north, they will not vote in governments that may believe in climate change to help the global south. Because when I go to global south meetings and people tell me, but Shouldn't the Western governments pay money? I say, yes, they have to pay the money, but how do they do it if they don't get the right people elected? And then so you have to have justice also in the global north in order to get this problem solved. So coming back to my conceptualization of justice, you can also break me and ask questions if you want. All right, coming back to my conceptualization of justice. So I think we need ideal justice, recognition justice, epistemic justice, data justice. We need interspecies justice, intergenerational, intergenerational. And this must feed into our procedural justice and our substantive justice. And then in the substantive justice, we must address the causes of climate change as well as inequality. And that means ensuring a certain number of things. So let me try to explain it. So in terms of my storyline, and I'm connecting it to that, the fact that we have not yet defined, we are still trying to address inequality issues over here, which is the definitions and promotions of inequality in society. One of the ways to address that is to meet the minimum needs of all people worldwide so that they can escape from poverty. So that's the first goal, is everyone should have access to a minimum. The second goal is that you must address the drivers of climate change. So growth, for example, but profit and accumulation, fossil fuel lobbies, instrument investment strategies, inappropriate technologies, tax injustice, and so on. You could also say that because we don't have a target, we need a target. And we need to make sure we don't miss the 1.5 degree centigrade target, because it will have a huge problem for all of us. It also means that if there's a small budget and there are stranded assets, how do we allocate who has the right to emit? Otherwise, everyone does what they want, and it will never, never add up to the goals we want. We also need to look at how responsibilities should be allocated and how we should create liability instruments. So let's talk about the first one. All right, so I now come back to our big climate story, which is the safe, yes.
Sorry, could I ask a question about one of the previous points that you mentioned? Because I was actually thinking, like, there is this need for like cross-national funding from like global north countries to global south countries for the historical debt that they have. But I'm wondering if of countries that want nothing to do with that kind of funding in the global south that are trying, for example, to, I don't know, industrialize and create the funds themselves to adapt. If there are examples of countries that don't depend necessarily on adaptation and mitigation money from global
Little
north.
adaptation and mitigation money anyway, that most of them have to be self-reliant. So it's not as if there's such large amounts of money going to the global south. It's not that. Most of these countries are having to suffer themselves. So if you take Pakistan, which had this massive flood, which affected 1/3 of its country, most of the money is coming from internal resources. So there is, they have no choice. Yes?
Yeah, I also wanted to ask a question because you're moving to another part of the presentation. I had two questions. The first one is, why do you think countries are choosing emissions trading systems instead of carbon tax? I personally don't understand why they're relying on markets, and you see, like, for example, a new emission trading systems like in China, the price of 1 ton is super low, whereas the government could have just done a carbon tax, and the same could be said about Europe and so on. And then the other question I had is, I see a lot of Middle Eastern countries, like Gulf countries, really talk a lot about carbon capture and carbon storage. And I know, like, from an activist point of view, I know it's not feasible. But I wanted to know if in the near future, with the current inaction that we have, whether you think that would be feasible in a future in which we cannot like get rid of fossil fuel.
Joyeeta, before to answer, guys, my proposal is that in the 30 minutes left to the break, just ask questions for understanding the main point, and then we have the discussion after the break. So it's not for stop your questions, but if it is for understanding something that is misleading or not clear, feel free to rise. Otherwise, if it is for discussion, it is after the break. Okay?
Maybe a last question. So my question is about justice. And you said that at this point in time, everyone should be reducing their emissions. And that means also at this point, global South countries will never reach the same, at least the same level of development as global North. How do we call that justice? And isn't it more totalitarian than of an idea as just between both global?
So the question, of course, is the current increase of wealth more important than the fact that maybe from 15 years from now, your water system and your environmental system is so completely damaged that their income goes down massively? That's the question. And the other question is, are we talking about wealth in terms of GDP, or are we talking about development in a society? So if you take let's take Delhi. Delhi is extremely polluted, and everybody that can afford it has got air purifiers in every room of the house. Now, producing that air purifier makes your GDP go up, but nature was giving it free of cost to you. So on the one hand, it looks like GDP is going up, but actually, why should you spend money on that when you could have a clean air? And the poor people can't afford that. So the question is to think differently about this. If you look at 1/4 of our healthcare, deaths and morbidity is coming from the impacts of environmental issues. And we can say, yeah, you know what? We want to spend money to become very rich very fast. And okay, so what if doctors get more work? Then they will also earn a lot of money and then that'll go up. What do you include in GDP? Do you want people to get sick and then go to hospitals and then get better because you want to create jobs for doctors and to get your GDP up? Or do you want a society with healthy people and healthy nature? That's the question. So what is development? And is development what we say is development in the global north using the mechanism of GDP calculation? That's the issue. So, of course, you're right in the sense that what you're saying is exactly what I'm hearing from governments, because they say, why are you telling us to change our behavior? We need to focus on increasing wealth. Yep. All right, so here, I'll come back to all your questions. I won't dodge them. But basically, for climate change, I told you earlier, 1.5 degrees is what we proposed as the safe target, as the Earth Commission, and 1 degree as the just target, because at 1 degree, about 1% of the global population is affected. But we also came up with other safe targets for other areas, plus just targets for air pollution and nitrogen. We're still working on just targets in other areas. I can explain this if we have time later. But where are we in relation to these targets? We are the yellow ball. We have crossed most of these targets in different parts of the world. And the only target we have not breached is air pollution globally, but air pollution is the biggest killer locally. So that's why you have the white ball inside. So this means if you're outside the system, you have to come back into the system, which means all of us have to reduce our production, consumption, investments. But have we met minimum needs? No, we have not. So if you want to meet the minimum needs of people as mentioned under the SDGs or under human rights, then let's take the human right to water, food, energy, and infrastructure. I'm talking about 3 bulbs in a refrigerator, a house the size of a parking lot. It's really quite small. And then if I look at what does that mean in terms of pressure on the environment, and I had a lot of colleagues who did this calculation, then we can see what is the impact on the boundaries. We differ from the donut approach in that we calculate these 2 numbers in the same level, in the same units. So in this graph, 0 to 90% is outside the graph. The blue shows you the current impact of the world in 2018 on different systems: nitrogen, phosphorus, land, water, climate change. Now, in orange, we show you what would happen if we met the bare minimum human rights of those people below the minimum. And in pink, we show you what happens if we give them a little bit more so that they can escape from poverty. This does not include access to healthcare, access to education, access to telephone, and access to clothes. They're all naked people over here. All right. So what you see is that if you do this, you get a 26% increase in greenhouse gas emissions. That's a huge amount. So this is a thought experiment. Huh? We have not achieved this. So that's a huge amount. And that tells me that if we want to get to 1.5, we have to make sure that when we create the systems to meet the minimum needs, we don't do it with fossil fuel, but we do it with renewables or something else. All right. And then if I go to my next graph, I told you earlier, we have to reduce our consumption globally. And we have to make space for the poorest. So how do we do this? We spent a lot of time in the Earth Commission thinking how to do this. And eventually we concluded that all of us in this room and everybody gets 3 bulbs and a refrigerator and a house the size of a parking lot, right? Then you get the the blue line, the dotted blue line. The dark blue line is your just boundary. And the green space in between for climate change is the space you have for your flights to come to this university or for buying a telephone or something else, right? This is for 2018. We did the same exercise for 2050. And then if you give everybody in the world 3 bulbs and a refrigerator, there's no more money or time or energy, whatever, to fly a plane or do anything else. Are you with me? Unless we drastically change the system that we have, unless we drastically move away from fossil fuel. And that is the message. And of course, in this one, we didn't take many new technologies into account, which could reduce emissions, but we also didn't take into account the military and the AI systems that will increase emissions. So this is the big challenge that is facing us. So it brings us to, we need to solve climate change by addressing some of the main drivers. Last year, the World Economic Forum said that misinformation and disinformation is the #1 security risk to the world today. And this is telling people that there is no climate problem. So we have to fight that. There's also the growth, the desire for continuous growth based on an outdated view of what is growth and technologies. The desire to continuously accumulate wealth and to create debt is another problem. The way we invest our money, today you can get higher returns on investment from fossil fuel than from solar. And that may be because when you have fossil fuel, you have a monopoly control over the fuel. But when you have solar panels, you sell the panels and then people produce it themselves. So you don't have that much profits in that. Production of fossil fuel, production of goods and services, all that is a driver. But you also have drivers of inequality, which is that local to global commons are not being protected. Because if, for example, you have dirty air in the city and you are rich, you have your air purifier, you're still okay. But the poor person is getting COPD and all kinds of health problems and is made poorer because that person can't do any work. Do you follow? So it creates inequalities. Ditto for climate change impacts, which makes the farmers become poorer. Tax injustice is another area where you find that there's not enough revenue coming to the state, so the state cannot distribute. Then there's non-provision of merit goods, drinking water, street lights, which create problems in many parts of the world, and unequal exchange. The way we trade is very unequal right now. Let me talk a little bit about fossil fuel companies. Fossil fuel companies are facing an existential crisis. All their money is in the fossil fuel infrastructure, in the fossil fuel employees. So what they did from 1950 till the late end of the century was to deny climate change. Casting doubt first, there is no real climate change, don't worry, Then they were questioning science and they were questioning scientists. They were lobbying heavily with government because they have a lot of money. They can wine and dine government officials, or at least they used to. And there's revolving door. Revolving door means senior oil company officials join government jobs and people from government join the oil and coal companies. That was denial. Then they moved into delay, and then they claim now we are necessary. I was at a meeting last week where I heard somebody from an oil company saying, but we are so necessary for Africa's development. So they are framing themselves now as the party that will create development for Africa because they bring the necessary resource. And they keep talking about the inevitability and the naiveness of climate scholars, that they don't understand the inevitability of fossil fuel. They do a lot of greenwashing, omissions, half-truths. They focus on techno-optimism, faith in innovation, carbon capture storage. They want to maintain the status quo. And of course, now they're doing strategic blame displacement. Why are you blaming me? It's you. You want to fly. You want to drive. You want to go to colleges. You are the problem, not me. I'm just trying to give you the best fossil fuel I can. So, you're getting a whole storyline because they're trying to avoid liability. Of course, growth, I don't want to spend too much time in, but one of the big things you must remember is that if you do a new fossil fuel investment today, you're not doing it for 2 years. You're doing it for the next 40, 50 years. So normally you take a loan from somebody to invest in that fossil fuel industry. You're taking that loan in dollars or euros, and the interest rate, if you're from Africa, is pretty high. Sometimes you have to pay 24% interest rate, okay, compared to when you do it in Europe when you're paying 6% or 5% interest rate, right? So what happens is if you've taken that loan for a 40-year period, you can't stop after 10 years. You're stuck because you have to keep selling it to be able to pay back the loan. And that is called lock-in. And that's lock-in. We're all locked into the system of private cars because public transport isn't there half the time, or you can't cycle where you want to go to. So that's a bit of a problem. And we need to really learn from other parts of the world about how to do this better. If I look at accumulation and debt, the richer you are, the more you're going to spend your money investing in energy intensive products and goods and fossil fuel because your returns are high. Accumulation often occurs by dispossession. So you will find that in many of these companies, the guy who's doing the lithium mining or whatever, the fossil fuel mining, is hardly earning anything, but the man at the top is earning a hell of a lot. And so the money is all drained out of the process, and it's accumulation by dispossession. The global south countries apparently pay 5 times more on repaying debt internationally than on climate action, which means that if you were to focus on debt for climate, there would be immediately a lot more money available in the developing countries to invest in climate action. And most of these countries have paid back the capital anyway. You also see that fossil fuel drives debt, and debt drives extraction. So if you already have a huge international debt and you have to get dollars or euros to pay that debt back, then you are forced into extracting the oil and gas to sell it to somebody else, because it's not that you're using it for your own people, it's because you're using it to sell it back somewhere else. So this creates this whole process of debt. And basically, I think we need much more tax justice, and much more debt for climate. And then maybe our governments will have enough money to invest in many of these areas. One of my PhD students was calculating that you just needed a certain percentage of billionaires in Europe to finance the energy transition, and they would still remain billionaires. So, it's not like the money isn't there in the system. It is there. And how do we get that money, and how do we mobilize these people to change society for the better? If you look at investors, then we look at pension funds. So many of us in Europe, you guys don't have pensions, you're too young, but many of us in Europe have pretty decent pensions. We're probably the last batch to have decent pensions. But anyway, that pension fund of Europe and America is so big. It is investing in a lot of things, but also in fossil fuels, because they say they have to protect our income. But my argument at the back is that suppose you give me the income I'm supposed to have, but the price of food goes up because the climate has changed so much, or the price of commodities, and what's the point of me having all that income? Or if I'm going to fall sick. So those are things we have to think about. Ditto. Oh. Ditto for things like philanthropy. Philanthropy also invests quite heavily in different types of fossil fuels, as do banks. So it's really important to look at this issue. Another thing you must keep in mind is the problem of contracts. So I've been speaking to people in the port of Amsterdam, and they have a lot of fossil fuel coming into the port. And they tell me it is really difficult for them to stop, because they have these long-term contracts with all these companies that are coming to bring the fossil fuel there. And then they have the contracts with the airlines companies to make it sure that they get fossil fuel. So it's very difficult for them to apparently end these contracts, and that's a really big issue. Also in Europe, we have the Energy Charter Agreement, which protects these fossil fuel companies when they are foreign companies with a national government. So even if they close down because there's no demand, they can demand compensation from the government for closing down the fossil fuel company. And now And now you see that many European countries are trying to get out of the Energy Charter, but it takes many years before the sunset clause comes to an end. But then the Energy Charter Secretariat is trying to invite developing countries to join, saying, if you join us, then you will get more investments. But there is a catch. And so you need to remember the catch in this whole process. I think in terms of those who produce fossil fuel companies, they are hiding behind misinformation, disinformation, contracts, and investment agreements. They have an existential crisis, so they're going to fight till the end. And they do try to control society, labor markets, politicians directly and indirectly. And so we have to try to figure out how do we break this control over society from these companies. I can give you one statistic here. In 2019, pension funds were 51% of global GDP. So that's how big they are. And they could make a huge difference with the way they invest. So we have to really focus on the big investors and try to mobilize them to change their behavior. I'm going to skip a few slides, if that's okay with you. So we were talking about this carbon budget. Today we have a default allocation. Some countries can do how much they can take out, but that doesn't really help. And I think we have to start thinking about, are we serious about 1.5? If we are serious about 1.5 or serious about 2 degrees, what does it mean in terms of who can emit what? And how do we do this? And how do we hold governments responsible for long-term targets? And that is really the critical story that we have to face. But it is challenging for governments. So in this slide, which my colleague Yang Chen made, you can see the mines worldwide. The mines in white have a short lifetime, 5 to 10 years left. The mines in red have a long lifetime because they have just been opened a few years ago. So basically what you can see is for Europe to close down the most of the mines is not going to be a serious problem. But for China and India and Southeast Asia, it's going to be very, very expensive, almost as much as their GDP. So this is one of the challenges that we face in trying to convince these countries to take a different approach. So we can allocate harm in many ways, but I thought I'll show you something that one of my master's students has worked on. On the bottom, you can see that the cases against fossil fuel companies have been going up. So basically, people are getting motivated to fight against fossil fuel companies. On the other hand, we also here have SLAP litigation, strategic litigation against public participation. And that is when big companies take NGOs to court to harass them and make them so afraid to go back to take the company to court. You understand? It's a counter narrative. So that's a bit of a problem. What we also see, if you look over there, this is 2020 and that's 2025, you see already the number of court cases are increasing in different parts of the world. So that's important to note. The other thing is North America has a lot of court cases, probably because North America was not actively participating in some of these international agreements. We have at this moment 3 major advisory opinions of international courts. The International Tribunal on of the Law of the Sea has come out and said that CO2 should be treated as a pollutant, which means that you need an environment impact assessment for emitting CO2. And it's such a basic idea that it seems crazy that you have to get a judgment at the international level to do this. But hopefully that will be respected. I don't know. Then you have the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, which came out with a story about how climate change is now an emergency issue and that it violates massively the human rights of people. Since you're human rights scholars, you should look at that judgment if you haven't already done so. It's full about the details of the violations of human rights. And thirdly, you have the International Court of Justice advisory opinion. And basically, it says that you must look at the climate change agreement and other agreements not as a fragmented storyline, but that they can be read together. So the climate change agreement has to be read in line with biodiversity, desertification, and human rights. So you have to do that. However, it didn't go a step further to say you must look at climate change as well as trade and WTO at the same level. That was not done. That's the next step. The next thing it says that all countries, all, I repeat, have a responsibility not to cause significant harm to others and the system. And this is a duty towards all people. They did, however, say significant harm to the system as opposed to significant harm to people. But I think we should be happy that they concluded that 1.5 degrees centigrade is the current legally binding target of the Paris Agreement. So not 2 degrees, but 1.5. And then they say all countries must take nationally determined contributions, and every new contribution must be more severe or stronger than the previous one. And altogether, it should add up to 1.5. And then they say failure of a state to take action may constitute an internationally wrongful act. And that's important. That means you're basically causing an illegal act, and that the state must regulate private actors within the state. I see 5 major tragedies that can turn into opportunities. The first is that governments, small governments, companies, SMEs, households, they all say my emissions don't matter, but every emission matters. Second, there are places that say I'm spending my money well, but they ignore how they earn the money. And very often they're earning the money in fossil fuel. So you need consistency in income and expenditure. Some countries say my emissions are so high, I cannot do anything without going bankrupt. And I think there you have to say you have the critical mass to lead. Come on, take on the challenge, try to solve this problem. Some say, why should I take actions? Others are not doing so. And I think you have to tell these people to take action in terms of scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions. Scope 3 emissions is somebody else's scope 1 emission. And if you take all the scopes, then you're causing double counting, triple counting, quadruple counting, but that's really good because that's the only way we can try to get back to 1.5. And some people say my government doesn't care, so what? Let's mobilize municipalities, provinces, because we will all suffer. At the start of the lecture, I said, you have to stop being just students, you have to become citizens. And that's our responsibility because if we don't all come together, we won't win. So I think that it's not enough to talk about energy security. We need to talk about climate security. That comes back to your question because your question is about also development, etc. And a lot of countries say, I need short-term energy security. Yeah, but what happens if you don't have climate security tomorrow? What happens to your farmers? What happens to everybody that uses water in your country for their production process? They will all suffer. So it's a question of balancing energy security with climate security. And climate security is win-win because it enhances health and well-being. It makes sure that there's a stable supply chain by preventing labor challenges because of health issues, water challenges. It reduces company liability for causing harm through the court cases I was showing you just now, and it reduces lock-in, and it can be net positive. So there is a reason for all of us to get active on this issue and to promote action. And I would like to end with thanking my sponsors, the European Research Council Advanced Grant and the NVO Spinoza Grant. Thank you.